Okay, so I see Henrik is on, Klaus is on. You guys have your videos off, which is perfectly fine. We're going to get started in about 10 seconds. And I'm going to ask everybody to mute. And I want to welcome everybody on board. Again, the people who are on the Facebook stream, you can just watch it and you can stay on Facebook. But if you want to ask me any questions and interact during the Q&A after the presentation, then you need to switch over to the Zoom call, because right now I can't interact with the Facebook Live. All right? So we are right on schedule. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know a lot of people are on different time zones. If I'm looking around, I'm not reading a script. There's a bunch of screens and a bunch of cameras in front of me. So I got to remember to look at this camera. It's the camera that you all are watching. So if I'm looking around, it's just because I got too many screens going on. Okay, so today is our China Business Essentials webinar. We're going to be talking about killer tips for effective communications in China. And as you can see, this is a series of webinars about really doing business in China, and this is the third one in the series. And today is really about how do you communicate effectively in China, and actually what that actually means to communicate effectively in China. Okay? So for all of you out there, whether you're listening live, whether you're watching on Facebook, or whether you're watching the replay, I want people to really start thinking and triggering your imagination. So if I were to give you a $100,000 travel budget and you were 100% fluent in Mandarin Chinese, what would that get you as far as doing business in China? And the reason that I start with this question is because when I first started having business activities in China, this is what I was given. I was already a 100% fluent speaker in Mandarin Chinese, and I was given a $100,000 travel budget to do my business in China. And one of the things that the company didn't invest in, other than the travel expense, is they didn't invest in any training or consulting. And the thought process was, I speak fluent Mandarin Chinese, I have an MBA degree, I have an engineering degree, that should be enough. But the answer to this question is, having 100% fluent in Mandarin Chinese and going to China to do business doesn't always lead to the outcomes you expect. And what ultimately ended up happening, and I did a case study about this, which you can read about later, is that the channel partner that we were working with started siphoning products through the supply chain. And what does that mean? That means that products that we were selling to our key customers through our distributor or channel partner, they found a way to extract additional products out of the supply chain and then resell it back through the supply chain as a way for them to extract additional revenue for themselves, but causing disruption with the customer and also causing issues with what we were trying to do as far as managing channel conflict and all the sales in China. And all of the travel expenses in the world and my fluency in Mandarin Chinese really didn't help solve that problem. Another thing that happened was the partner that we were working with, because we were a naive American company doing business in China, we didn't really understand that having trademarks registered outside of China or global trademarks were relevant in China. And I think even Apple has had this problem with their iPhone, but in our case, my distributor or my channel partner ended up being the one who secretly registered all of our trademarks in China. And he did this obviously with malicious intent, and speaking Mandarin Chinese didn't really stop this kind of behavior. And the final thing is that this partner that we were working with initially ultimately ended up becoming a competitor. And this happens to foreign companies operating in China all the time. And they did that by creating fake products with fake labels. And they, of course, didn't really care what the contents of the products actually were, as long as they could get away with selling something. Okay, so even though I had a six-figure travel expense budget to conduct my business in China, even though I spoke 100% fluent Mandarin Chinese, it was still not enough to prevent this type of behavior with one of my partners? So this is really what we're talking about today. When we talk about effective communications in China, we first have to really understand or define what do we mean by effective, okay? Does it mean that they understand you? Is that effective communications? Does it mean that you understand them? Is that enough to be qualified as effective communications? And the question that we really have to ask ourselves when we're doing business in China is just understanding each other enough to achieve the outcome or the success that we want across cultural differences. And the reason that I say that is because most Westerners like me, I'm an American who was born and raised in the United States, my style of communication is very transparent and it's very direct. So when I just like to be honest, I like to be truthful, I like to be transparent. This is what I was raised or how I was raised to communicate. But what happens if the people that you're communicating with in China, they're more accustomed to being vague and non-committal, okay? This is not the Chinese people being deliberately deceitful. This is just culturally how they communicate in an environment where giving and receiving a face is something that is really how not just business, but how the entire society is kind of socially how it runs by giving and receiving face. The question that you really have to ask yourself is, what can you do about it when the communication styles actually are in conflict with one another? And the other thing is, when we talk about being successful doing business in China, we often talk about what is the mindset adjustments that you have to make, and how do you make the right mindset adjustments, or what I call develop a mindset for China business. So it's important to understand how it affects you internally, okay? When people are communicating in a circular manner, when they're vague, when they're non-committal, when you can't seem to get a straight answer, how do you feel? And if you're frustrated, does that lead to skepticism that this is the person that you can trust? And if you already feel there's a lack of trust, how does that affect how you communicate and what your attitude is towards these people? Because ultimately, people respond to how they feel. And if your attitude is that you don't really trust the people that you're communicating with, what are the negative ramifications of that? And what we really want to focus on is, how does that affect your approach? The mindset that you have when you're communicating with somebody who is vague and non-committal, how does that affect your approach? And is there any subconscious bias into how you approach your communications? Okay, because the thing to keep in mind is that when a typical Western or American like me goes to China, we fundamentally have different values, different priorities, different tactics, different habits, and ultimately we have a different perspective. So we can't just, it's not just enough that I understand what you're saying and I think you understand what I'm saying. The communication breakdown really happens is because we don't really understand the cultural context of what Chinese people value, and we actually don't have the right mindset for China business. So one of the things that I'm going to focus on very quickly in this short keynote is some important mindset adjustments that you should be mindful of when you are doing business in China as a foreigner. Okay, the first one is understanding that in China, everything really ultimately revolves around this concept of face. So we hear this in politics all the time. What is the face-saving way for this politician to still be able to do whatever? When you go to China as a Westerner or as an American, the requirements of giving and receiving face is amplified and is magnified. And the mindset adjustment that you really have to make is that everything in China revolves around face or mianzi. And why is that? Because this leads into the second mindset adjustment that I think is really important is we hear this term Gwenci all the time and we think, oh, in China you have to develop Gwenci relationships, and what does that mean? And then people will say, well, yeah, in our country we have to develop Gwenci relationships too. I mean, you have to have good relationships with the people that you work with. In China, the nuances of what Gwenci actually is very important. And I'm going to explain later in this presentation why most foreigners really don't understand the context and the nuance of developing Gwenci. But first of all, it's the mindset. The mindset is to first kind of assume that the purpose of every word or every action or every gesture that the people that you're communicating with in China exhibit, their subconscious intention is to give face and to develop Gwenci, okay? And this is really just a way for you to understand it in terms that you can kind of imagine, which is Chinese think more in a circular manner, and their reasoning is very circular, and it really does not conform to a linear logic. So I think comparatively, myself as an American, I think more into cause and effect. When I ask an answer, I want a yes or no response. And sometimes that's very difficult in China because that's not how Chinese people think. They think in a circular way. So very rarely is there a yes or no answer to a complex question, even though we as Westerners think that it may be relatively simple. I'm asking you a yes or no question. Can you give me the answer? And then this ties into the final mindset adjustment that I think you have to make is really about time. And why is time important? Because in a circular reasoning or circular time, time is almost irrelevant. And that's why you'll hear a lot of China experts tell you that when you do business in China, you have to have patience. Patience basically means you're too anxious to get the answer or to get the result or the outcome. And that's not the tempo or the rhythm that the people you're communicating with in China are accustomed to. All right. So, and you also have to understand in a culture where giving and receiving of face is really important, time and managing your level of patience is really important to not only prevent giving other people a loss of face, but also preventing yourself from losing face. Okay, so the question really becomes, how can you, as a business person, as a foreigner doing business in China, create a new reality? And the answer really is to actually develop a winning approach. So based on the four kind of mindset things that you really need to start thinking about and start developing, I'm gonna just kind of go over very briefly what are some of the winning approaches based on this framework that I'm gonna talk about here, but we go much more in depth in a lot of our training programs and our courses, but this is kind of just a high level overview. So as far as the mindset of everything revolving the giving and receiving of face, you really should develop a habit of praising people in public, but giving any kind of feedback or what we call constructive criticism in private. And this is the most difficult part for most foreigners, is that you have to really begin to understand that there's always an indirect path to getting the answers that you want. And if you've been working in China, I see some of the people on the call have a lot of experience in China. When you take the direct path and you try to ask somebody, you put them on the spot to get a yes or no answer, that generally is not going to lead to a satisfactory answer to help you figure out what the next step is. Okay? Of course, then it comes down to Gwenci is, well, you really have to develop awareness that Gwenci is based on a system of exchanging goodwill and reciprocity. And Gwenci is like a currency that basically helps the economy and helps the system in China go. And I have another slide after this about how Gwenci works in China. And the third thing is the logic, the linear thinking versus a circular thinking. So this is where we get into kind of art of war tactics. And we give you advice, and we're going to talk about this in the example, where you want to align on process when you're negotiating with somebody in China in order to kind of compel or force people to actually take action and make forward progress. And when you're just being transparent, that actually doesn't lead to that kind of result. And we're going to talk about a tactic about being deliberately vague, but being deliberately vague, not as being disingenuous, but aligning to the Chinese culture and the way that they communicate. And the final thing is, the winning approach is, why do people say when you go to China, you should just be patient, or you need to be patient, is because a lot of times we lose our patience. So the key about time is you really have to control your emotions. You have to expect that Chinese people are not being deliberately difficult to communicate with, but it is your responsibility to find a way to communicate with them that is more compatible if you want to communicate effectively. Okay, so Gwenci is based on this thing that we call kind of it would be analogous to kind of like a bank account, and you have a Goodwill account balance. And the key to developing Gwenci relationships is to really have a lot of transactions, but a net zero balance. What does that mean? That means that you haven't given more favors than you have received. That means you haven't given so much goodwill that you're waiting for somebody to repay you back, and you haven't accepted so much goodwill that you really kind of owe somebody. The key to developing Gwenci relationships is to have many, many transactions back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and who owes somebody what is always roughly around zero. You know, if I buy dinner this time, then you'll buy dinner the next time, and we'll fight over the bill just to make sure that Goodwill account balance is kind of in balance, where I don't over owe you too much and you don't over owe me too much. And this whole system of reciprocity in China is based on the giving and the receiving of face. And one thing that foreigners misinterpret is, yes, if you give somebody a red packet or you give somebody money, that is goodwill. But 99% of the face giving that you give does not have to include money, and it does not have to include anything corrupt. You just have to understand the nuances of what it actually means to give somebody face and make them feel good about their collaboration or their partnership with you. And the long-term benefits of this really are, it strengthens the partnership, it fosters more discretionary effort. So one of the things that we discover a lot in China is, because it's such a face-giving culture, if you really think about what giving face is, it's kind of disingenuous. You're telling people nice things when you don't really think nice things. The real key about having good Gwenci relationships is that it fosters more discretionary effort. You get less lip service, and people are actually trying to help you succeed as opposed to just leading you on, making you feel like they're doing all the right things when behind your back, they're actually doing something different. So ultimately, and we get into this in a lot of our training, maintaining and developing Gwenci relationships is how you actually reduce the likelihood of bad behavior. The things that we call unethical and corrupt, these are actually all preventable if you actually develop a mindset for China business, you focus on the Gwenci relationship, and you understand how to communicate effectively in China. Okay? So I'm going to give a real quick kind of killer tip on something that you might encounter almost all the time when you go to China, and that is, you're negotiating with somebody and your potential partner is kind of vague and non-committal during the negotiation process. Okay? So one of the things that we have to think about is, what is the benefit of this behavior? All right? And what is the cultural context of this behavior? And the reason that we start here is because everything about succeeding in China is really about mindset. Okay? So the mindset is, first we have to understand that the benefit of this behavior is like when you're negotiating, you're playing poker. And you never want to reveal your whole cards when you're at the poker table. So that's the analogy, okay? And what happens is, a lot of Westerners think, I want to put all my cards on the table immediately, and I think that should get the response that I want or the commitment that I want, but 99% of the time it doesn't happen. And then we find something else to put on the table to be even more transparent, and this is when the frustration starts to build, because then we start to sense that the Chinese people are kind of non-committal and they're very vague, and this process just drags on and on and on. And the cultural context of this behavior is not that they're doing it deliberately. The cultural context is, this is the environment in which the Chinese people were raised, in a system where it's a hierarchical command and control, top-down kind of system based on kind of Confucius teachings to maintain social harmony and not have conflict, there's really no incentive for people to speak out in certain ways. Now, you're not, of course, the younger generation in China are very opinionated, and that's one of the complexities of doing business in China, is that demographically, by age, people think different and they behave something completely different, okay? So what tactics can be used to overcome this type of behavior if you're negotiating in China? And my advice from, if I'm not working with you directly, it's just general advice which doesn't have any context with the situation, is to align on process, okay? So a lot of, experts or consultants will tell you you need to find somebody that shares similar values. That's really not the right way to go, because if you're an American like me, born and raised in the US, you're not going to find somebody who was born and raised in China that actually shares similar values. That's just not going to happen. The goal of success is to align on process. And I say deliberately vague, not as being disingenuous or being untruthful, but being deliberately vague is just a cultural way of speaking. And you're going to discover that the more you engage with China. But in the mindset of how you communicate, it's really worrying less about the specifics and worrying more about the trends or the leading indicators. It's almost like project management. You want to kind of compel people to get to certain milestones, demonstrate certain measurable actions before you will put more cards on the table. And being deliberately vague means you don't put all your cards on the table kind of immediately. And the way to really think about this in a practical way when you're doing business in China is being vague means that the focus is now shifted away from promises. And if you're doing business in China and you're negotiating, you know that promises are really shallow and the promises are really empty. So you flip that around, your promises are probably shallow and empty too. And being deliberately vague actually shifts the focus away from promises that really don't have any meaning or value when you don't have Gwenci relationships towards developing better Gwenci relationships. All right. So this is a different way to think about what it means to be deliberately vague. It just means that you don't put all your cards on the table and you focus more on developing Gwenci, as opposed to, can you commit to this? This is what I can do. All those things that you say on the front end really have almost no benefit on the back end once the partnership starts beginning, all right, or begins, all right? So all of this that we talked about today is really about introduce a masterclass program that begins on March the 27th. And my whole concept and my whole theory is that knowing how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say Chinese. Because when I first went to China and I spoke fluent Mandarin Chinese and I had a $100,000 travel expense budget, that didn't help me develop the Gwenci that I needed, and it didn't help me achieve the goals that I wanted. And I'm developing this masterclass to teach you how to negotiate winning partnerships in China without having to speak Chinese. And it's a 6-week program, okay? It has, well, the online portion has 5 modules, 25 lessons. There are mindset exercises, there are case studies. But the real value of this 6-week program is all of the live interactions, very similar to this Zoom meeting that we're gonna have. So as soon as you register, when the course starts, there's going to be 2 different orientations. So people in different time zones can try to catch one or both of them. There's going to be 3 live Zoom group coaching calls per week, okay? And all of the replays of the coaching calls and the orientation, all of that is going to be posted so you can watch replays, just like you can watch the replay of this keynote address. And everything's going to be kind of managed with a closed Facebook group, Win Without Speaking Chinese Facebook group. It's actually a new Facebook group because I have a lot of people in my other Facebook group, CLD Nation. This is a new Facebook group exclusively for people who enroll in this class. It's for us to engage, to discuss, and collaborate about the issues that we are facing in China. And with this program, There's going to be a lot of bonuses that I'm going to get into. Okay, so this is kind of the 5 modules. We're going to start with the foundations for negotiating in China, the soft skills for effective communications, which is, again, having self-awareness, cultural awareness, empathy, and developing that mindset for China business where you can make the right adjustments to your attitude, mindset, and approach. It's also different tactics for negotiations, similar to being deliberately vague, but that's not the only one. Depending on the situation, there's a lot of tactics that can help you get the outcomes that you desire. The winning China-ship partnership strategies. So it's not just negotiating a successful agreement with somebody that you work in China, but all of the dysfunctional partnerships don't happen in the beginning. They happen in the end. So most people, including myself, when I first started doing business in China, is I didn't understand what it meant to have a winning China partnership strategy. And then we tie everything together in module 5 with a mindset for China business. How do you kind of develop a new way of thinking and working to be successful in China? Okay, so the Facebook group is called Win Without Speaking Chinese. We're really going to use this Facebook group to kind of vlog with each other. I will be personally answering all of your questions, looking at your assignments, and really to help you achieve tangible results. This is the difference between this program and intercultural training that other people might be offering. How do you get straight answers when you are trying to solve problems in China? How do you create greater trust and loyalty if you're leading partners and leading employees? How do you develop real Gwenci relationships? All of this is going to happen in the Facebook group. There's going to be a ton of bonuses, and because this course is basically 6 weeks, I'm going to be releasing one bonus module every week as you go to the next module. And this is content that I've developed over the past kind of year and a half. All of these modules, all of these bonuses by themselves could kind of be standalone programs, but I've repurposed them. So for example, killer tips, 5 most common business challenges in China. Well, this is 9 videos, but now what we've done is we've kind of just summarized. You still get the 9 videos, but we summarized everything kind of in this cheat sheet. So you just kind of look at it. If I'm communicating, what are the common mistakes? What are the biggest misperceptions? If I'm negotiating, if I'm leading employees, if I'm working with Chinese consumers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so these are the bonuses. And I was talking about how much my company spent on travel. And that doesn't include money we spent on marketing. That was just travel. But we didn't spend any money on coaching, and we didn't spend any money on training. We just assumed that because I spoke Chinese, it would be enough to prevent the bad behavior of my partners that we talked about in the very beginning. So I wish my company would have sent me on some training that I'm going to offer you today. And this 6-week program is just $19.97. And if you want to break it up into a payment plan, it's just 4 payments of $500 spread out over 4 months. So even after the official 6 weeks is over, you'll still be kind of working through the payment system. But if you're doing business in China and you have a significant business exposure, I don't see how this is even a meaningful amount to spend, given that one business class ticket from the US to China is like $7,000. And what I'm offering everybody, whether you're on the live call, you're in the Facebook, or you're going to see the replay video of this after the fact, is my 100% guarantee that you're going to be able to dramatically improve your experience in China, your success in China, and the outcomes that you're going to achieve. And how do we do that? Well, the guarantee is a lot of hands-on participation, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to translate what I was able to achieve in live training and live coaching into an online program. And now that we have these tools where you can talk to me on Zoom, we can get on these one-on-one Zoom calls, and we can get on these kind of live Q&As every week to go through what we're learning in the modules. That's hands-on. And we're limiting the course enrollment to no more than 20 people. If we get 20, we're going to shut it off. We're not going to take more than 20 for this program. So it's a very limited class size. And the final thing is I'm offering you a 100% money back guarantee, no questions asked. So this is one of those programs where you're not forced to complete a certain amount of work. You're not forced to complete a certain amount of accountability where you have to be on a call and you have to do an assignment. Basically, it's just if after module 1, you feel that this is not going to help you achieve dramatically different outcomes when you do business in China, just let me know and you will get your money back 100%, no questions asked. So this 100% money back guarantee basically ends before the start of module 3. So after module 1, after your one-on-one coaching call, after the orientation, after you've consumed the first bonus in the first module, if you think, okay, this is really not going to help me achieve my goals, just let me know and you get 100% of your money back. This is what it costs. And of course, if you pay in full, what I'm offering everybody right now is also a private one-on-one China Business Advisory Services coaching call. So normally for a one-on-one session with me for 1 hour, I charge $500 because I want to make sure that everybody in this program is successful. When you pay in full, and you're going to get, again, it's risk-free, and you can even use your 1 hour coaching call with me and still ask for your money back. I'm going to give you, because I want to get to know you. The only way to help you solve your issues or frustrations in China is to actually get to know you personally, and we're going to do that through the Facebook group. We're going to do that through the live coaching call. We're going to do that through the weekly Zoom sessions, where it's going to be almost exactly like this, and there's going to be live Q&A exactly like we're doing after this call. Okay, so everybody who's registered for this webinar, you're going to get a link. Probably it could be in your inbox now. If it's not, check in your spam mail. There's going to be a link that goes to a replay, not the live replay that I just did, but a pre-recorded replay and how to register for the course. Again, this is hopefully giving you some valuable information on how to communicate more effectively in China, and introducing to you a course and a program that we put together. It's called Negotiate Winning Partnerships in China Without Speaking Chinese. And of course, this is a masterclass. And that is what I have to say for today. And what I want to do now is I want to open it up for Q&A. But before I open it up for Q&A, somebody submitted a question before the live webinar. So this is another thing that you can do once the course gets started. You can actually submit your questions in the Facebook group or with email directly with me. And this is how we're going to really socialize some of these things. Okay, so this question was submitted by somebody by the name of Du Wei, or Wei Du. Okay, so by the name, this person is obviously Chinese. And the question was how to clearly communicate expectations while preventing it from becoming a flashpoint that ruins the relationship. Okay, so there's a lot of nuance and context to this question. So obviously, this question was asked by a Chinese person about my approach to helping non-Chinese people communicate effectively in China. And I'm sure this person's experience is a lot of the discussions in China between foreigners and Chinese, between Americans or Westerners and Chinese people, often become contentious. And it's more and more so now, today, than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when 10 years ago, Chinese had more to learn from foreigners or from Westerners. So Westerners could get away with a lot more. In today's environment, Chinese people are now, you're going to experience, they're generally much more kind of confident or arrogant because China has become so strong and powerful on the global stage. So especially of younger Chinese, their attitudes have changed. Okay, so when the typical American would go to China and try to espouse these values, talk about things like freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of press, and talk about these things in a very righteous manner, it causes a lot of contention with Chinese people. Okay, so the question that was asked by this Chinese person is, how do you communicate effectively your expectations to prevent it becoming a flashpoint that ruins the relationship, which implies that a lot of relationships in China have been ruined because foreigners go to China and they have these righteous attitudes about what is right and what is wrong. And the answer to this question and this is what we talk about a lot in this course, the answer to this question is you have to develop what I call the essential soft skills that matter. You have to develop empathy to understand what the Chinese people value, how they think, and what their priorities are. And you have to develop awareness. You have to develop self-awareness, how you are perceived when you are saying the things the way that you say them, okay? And you have to develop cultural awareness, which is understanding your behavior in the context of the macro environment when you are in China, okay? This is what we're talking about. These are the mindset adjustments that we talked about in the beginning, understanding how important giving and receiving a face are, understanding the nuances of developing real Gwenci relationships and the continual exchange of goodwill and reciprocity. How does all that tie into your behavior, which is, again, module 5 of this course is where you start to understand what it means to have a mindset for China business, okay? So this is a question that was submitted by somebody before the webinar. I don't know if this person is on the webinar. What I'm gonna do now is I'm going to adjust my camera and welcome everybody to kind of unmute themselves. All right, if everybody can see me. See, we still have 9 people on the call. So does anybody have any questions? Wei, I see Wei. So Wei is probably the person who asked that question. Wei's iPhone 8 Plus. So Wei, if you want to jump in or make a comment on what we just talked about, and did I, was my kind of assumption right, where you've experienced a lot of difficult discussions with foreigners where something actually hurt the relationship before basically it even began?
Hey, I'm here. This is Wei.
Hey.
Hey.
Did you catch my answer?
I did. Actually, I think you put a little spin from my original question, but it's all valid. I think it's there is certainly that aspect of people going to China thinking they know better, they have more experience, but it's perceived in a condescending manner, so that kind of puts the conversation or relationship at a risk. There is certainly that part of the point, but also I was also coming from the Western culture, setting up the expectations from like a very straightforward manner. It's a norm, right? But in China, it becomes kind of a risky business where it sets up a stage for later disappointment or conflict. So
yeah,
I was also kind of interested in how to achieve the goal. You want to set clear expectations, but also kind of minimize the risk.
Yeah, let me ask you this way. Are you Chinese?
Yes, born and raised in China, but spent about 20 years in the US. Also spent last 10 years as an expat in China. So, okay, so I had some bruises on my shoulder, but I happen to be the kind of a bridge. A lot of times I got called in to kind of mitigate, right?
Because you speak Chinese. You speak Chinese.
Born and raised in China.
Yeah, but you've been living outside of China for a significant period of time.
Correct.
Now going back to China, you're struggling a little bit with
there was
how Chinese people behave.
Exactly. That was a reverse culture shock for me at the beginning.
Yeah. So so this is a great, again, excellent perspective for everybody else on the call. Wei speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese, but Wei, as you know, my course is when without speaking Chinese, right? Because knowing how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. And if you left China at a very early age, the business culture in China is completely different than what you're expected to, having spent 20 years outside of China. And I'm going to answer your question directly now. So you actually approach business in a very kind of, I'm just calling it a very global way, setting clear expectations, communicating clearly. How do you do that to not allow the negotiations to get contentious? My experience has generally been that sometimes setting clear expectations should not bleed into restricting what you're able to talk about. Okay. So a lot of times what foreign companies do, or foreigners, I'm just going to assume you're not Chinese now going into China, is we set the agenda, we set the expectations, and the perception that the Chinese people feel is that there's very little room for flexibility in negotiations. Okay. When you're negotiating with people in China, what happens is you don't actually have to commit to a lot of their demands. So what you're going to experience is Chinese people are going to demand and request a bunch of things. And most of those things you already know in your mind, the answer is no, or the answer is absolutely not, that's illegal, or there's no way I can do that. That's the general thing that you have in the back of your mind when somebody in China makes a request. The key to success is not saying, no, we can't do that, and not having a very strict agenda. The way is, and this is very Chinese, it's giving face. Even though their request is ridiculous, it's impossible that our company could ever allow something like that to happen, even though you know that to be the fact. The way that you answer that is, this is not something that we've done before, so I really need to think about it. Okay, and then you just leave it vague. Okay, and that's how you avoid conversations in China actually becoming contentious. Okay, and this is actually saying it in English does kind of translate, but if you say it in Chinese, it just makes much more sense. You know, you really basically say, 这个我要考虑看看，我们公司可能还没有做过这样子的方法，所以我真的要去请教我的上司。Right? Something like that. And that's how, even though you are Chinese by birth, you speak Chinese, you look Chinese, you already have this Western mindset. Okay. And even for you, you might benefit from developing a mindset for China business, which is kind of what this entire program is all about. And based on the experience that I said in the beginning, you know, I spoke fluent Chinese when I encountered all of those bad behaviors that many foreigners experience when they go to China. You know, theft, IP theft, copyright protection, stealing of products, making fake products, fake labels. I encountered all of that. And when I look back in hindsight, those things happen not because Chinese people are bad. It happened because I didn't take care of the Gwenci. And I didn't make my Chinese partner feel that I understood what they were requesting. I kind of just dismissed it, said, no way, 不可能, we can't do that. And that's ultimately what led to what I call in my training program, Goodwill Extraction, where as a foreigner, Chinese people understand the entire value chain in China much better than any foreigner, whether the foreigner speaks Chinese or not. And Chinese people are clever. So they're always going to be able to figure out a way to extract value from the cracks in the value chain. This is how they were raised. This is how Chinese people are brought up. In Chinese, it's called 占便宜. And it basically is just something culturally that people are kind of accustomed to. And society doesn't frown upon that. You know, when a Chinese person takes a small advantage of a foreigner, they're actually congratulated, right? They're not punished by the government. They're not punished by the legal system. They're not punished by their peers, and they're not shamed by society in China. So there is no incentive for them to not try to extract these kind of small advantages. Okay? So that's my take on that. How does that match with kind of what your experiences have been?
These are good, yeah, very good points, actually. I do have some other things to share later, but maybe like just open up for other people to also chime in. Otherwise, it's just you and I talking.
Well, I mean, I think if you have more questions, people can chime in or they can type in questions. I'm looking at the chat. If you have questions, that's what we want. So I'm not going to stop you for asking questions. Just this is important for everybody. I think your unique experience, also being somebody who speaks Chinese and encountering these issues, what I'm trying to say is being successful in China isn't about learning the language. It's about understanding the culture. And somebody in your position, illustrates that perfectly. So I would love to hear any additional experiences that you have or questions that you have.
Okay. I do have something else that, kind of pondered me for a long time, where as a business person, you encounter some hard bargaining sessions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then oftentimes your other side is trying to get absolutely the best deal he can get.
Right.
And then so like there's several ways to approach that. One I find out most successful, having a higher successful rate is you just early on you set something there. You try not to be giving the signal that you can be talked into a lower, better deal for them.
Mm.
I mean, I'm also interested to see if there are other, different approaches to that. Because if you become like if the other side sense you have room to give, he may never be satisfied. I don't know when is when the deal is done. Is it just from the get go you draw a line in the sand and says this is it, or you just keep on negotiating?
This is an excellent question. And this is exactly what this masterclass is all about. Negotiate winning partnerships in China without speaking Chinese. So what we have to do is we have to put your question into context. So kind of the question that you asked is during the negotiation process before the contract is signed, right? Yeah. Your experience is that whenever you kind of make a concession, the other side just keeps on asking for more. Where do you draw the line in the sand? How do you negotiate? All this and all that. So this is where it's very nuanced and it's very tricky, because and this is what I advise my clients when I coach them one-on-one, is when you are negotiating a new partnership in China, you have to think about the partnership over the life of the partnership and not stop your thinking at when the contract is signed. Okay. The reason that is because and there's two things that's happening. One is the general perception of bargaining power is shifting away from foreigners or foreign companies. It used to be if you were a Microsoft and you went into China, everybody wanted to do business with you. You had all the bargaining power. Okay. Now that China has its own internet giants, Alibaba, Huawei, Tencent, Baidu, they don't need foreign know-how as much as they did. Okay, so immediately, as a foreign company, if you're representing a foreign company, your bargaining power has gone down. So that's the context. That's what we call situational context or situational awareness. The second aspect of that is, if you think about the life of your partnership over time, what happens is if you get the best deal before the contract is signed, you're actually setting yourself up to fail over time. Because one thing that you're going to realize about Chinese people is Chinese people are very clever and they're very smart. And for foreigners, I'm going to call you a foreigner now, Chinese people have a different concept of what fairness means, what's fair and what's unfair. And what happens is if the Chinese people sign the contract and they feel that it's not quite fair, what's going to happen is over the life of the partnership, that leads to all of the bad behavior. That leads to the goodwill extraction. That leads to 占便宜. That leads to they're trying to figure out how to extract additional value out of this value chain because this partnership they negotiated with you wasn't really fair to begin with. And of course, nobody is the judge of what is fair and what is not fair. So it's very, very tricky to draw these lines in the sand and try to get the most that you can at the beginning of before the contract is signed, because that ultimately sets you up for something bad to happen down the road. My recommendation, and again, there's no absolute right or wrong answer, but my recommendation is, again, some of the things that we talked about in today's presentation. First of all, you have to have patience, which means you don't want to put all your cards on the table, right? Usually foreign companies behave like they're more anxious, which makes them in a weaker bargaining position, okay? The second is this is kind of like how Chinese think of the negotiation process. For a Western company going into China, the purpose of negotiations is to sign the contract, to get everything on paper. For Chinese people, and this is not a literal, Chinese people think in a circular manner, so they think in a very figurative way. It's not a linear way. For Chinese people, the negotiations begins after the contract is signed. Because for most Chinese people, they believe, I don't really care what's on the paper. Now that we've agreed to work together, now this is when I want to continue to develop Gwenci to see if I can get more and if I can get more. Okay, so the mistake that most Western companies make is they focus too much on the beginning of the negotiations and not enough on paving the way for success after the negotiations. And in the beginning, you just have to be, what I said, you have to be deliberately vague strategically, not putting all your cards on the table, aligning on process as opposed to aligning on values, forcing, kind of compelling the people that you're negotiating with to take that next level of demonstration, where they demonstrate to you they can actually do something before you give them more information or before you promise them more in the partnership, right? So I know this is kind of a long-winded answer, but the whole way you frame that question, if I was advising you, I would say that that's not the right mindset to go into negotiations with China, because you're trying to figure out where to draw the line, and you're looking at everything in a very short-term manner. What deal can I get people to agree to so we can sign the contract? That's a very American way of thinking about it. Okay, Chinese don't think that way. For the Chinese people, the negotiations begins after the contract is signed, and this is exactly what we talk about in this masterclass that I just announced. And we talk about the framework for negotiations in China, where for Chinese people, the negotiations begins after the contract is signed in order to prevent Chinese people from behaving badly, behaving in a corrupt manner. You have to have this continual system of reciprocity and goodwill, and it has nothing to do with money. Okay, a lot of people think it has to do with money. It does not. Chinese people value something more than money, and that's their face. As long as they feel like they're getting face, 你给面子, then they're going to be even in a closer Gwenci relationship with you, and that's going to help this partnership flourish and develop in all sorts of different ways beyond just what you sign on the agreement. And I have a lot of stories about this Western way of thinking actually caps the ROI. You're actually not unleashing the power of Chinese creativity, Chinese innovation, and Chinese ingenuity. Chinese people are very smart, very clever, and they know how to get things done in China. And when you put too many restrictions on the relationship and in the contract, you're basically just limiting the upside potential of what they can do for you. And that's kind of my point of view. So how does that help you with how you think about your negotiations? And are you actively in negotiations now?
Not right now. I'm just trying to kind of a recap to figure out, whether the techniques we put in was, make sense or not, either new train of thought, on approaching this. So you actually did share some interesting thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, like I said, so there are two classes of people that help people do business in China. There are consultants and there are intercultural trainers. So the intercultural trainers teach you about Chinese customs, Chinese culture, and different things like that. And consultants kind of give you a blueprint of how to prepare for your negotiations and how to do research and how to leverage your bargaining power and all of that stuff. None of them teach you what's important. And that's what I'm trying to teach. Okay. What is important is you actually develop a mindset for China business, and you're able to communicate with Chinese people in a way where you're not just kind of talking over each other or talking around each other. All right, so Wei, we've lost your video. I see a couple more. Oh, there you go. Your camera is kind of pointed up at the sky now, so I can't see you. So what are you currently living in China?
No, I'm back in the States. I'm in Los Angeles right now.
Oh, I'm in Irvine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So are you currently have responsibilities in China?
Yeah. Well, recently I shifted my role, so I'm like a consultant right now, working on some projects.
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything that you think I might be able to help you with?
Yeah. I mean, let me look at this course more. I mean, you said this is like a 5-module. It's like a classroom setting, right?
It's five modules. They're all online. It goes over a 6-week period. The modules themselves, you consume them online. They're basically 25 lessons. They're all video lessons. They talk more detail about some of the things we talked about today through that kind of course outline that we laid out. But really the value is the one-on-one private coaching session where we would just get on a one-on-one Zoom call. Every week, there's going to be 3 live Q&A calls, almost exactly like this. And it's almost like you posted a question and I would answer those questions whether you were on the call or not. And it would be recorded and all of the answers would be reposted into the Facebook group. So, and then there would be other China experts or China expats in that group. So everybody can kind of share their experience. Because again, there's really no one size fits all. You know, I'm giving very general answers, but I could be wrong depending on the very specific situation of your negotiations. But from my experience, you know, 80 to 90% of the things that I say will actually work, and it's counterintuitive, which means most people wouldn't think to behave that way or to communicate that way. But when you're in China, if you develop that mindset for China business and you shift the way that you approach things, you have a very Western approach, which is not bad. It's just a very Western approach. And because you're Chinese and you speak Chinese, what you're probably going to discover is that Chinese people will actually be more strict with you because they expect you to understand the way they communicate. If you go in there and you're blonde hair and blue-eyed and you don't understand the nuances of developing Gwenci and all that, well, they don't expect you to. But because you're Chinese, because you were born in China, because you speak Chinese, the expectation of you is going to be different. I had a client once who was from Hong Kong, and he experienced the exact same thing. They expected him to understand these things, and whenever he went in there, he was just frustrated because of all of the things that we talked about. You know, negotiations, people being non-committal, people being vague, him giving all the information but getting nothing in return. And he's been there, he's made several trips into China, he can't figure out what's going on. He's asking me, you know, how would I get these people to actually commit? And I told them, well, you have to align on process, right? Don't put all your cards on the table in the beginning, right? Because from the Chinese point of view, we're patient. When I say we now, I'm saying as Chinese, we're patient. And if you as the foreigner coming in, every time I don't give you an answer, you give me more information, well, I'm just going to wait for as much information as I can. So you're actually encouraging the bad behavior. And even the corruption and the unethical behavior in the modules and the case studies, we get into why my foreign companies experience what I experienced all the time. You know, they steal your products, they copyright your products, they produce fake products, fake labels, whatever. That happens a lot in China. What most companies don't realize, or most foreigners don't realize, is that that behavior is 100% preventable. And the reason why Chinese partners eventually behave that way is because you don't continue to develop the right Gwenci relationships. There's not this continual exchange of reciprocity and goodwill. 没有诚意去做生意. Right? So
Henrik has a question, Gene, in the chat.
Oh, okay. Sorry. All right. When we negotiate, it can take a long time to build the necessary trust. What can we do to speed this up? All right. So, Henrik, if you're still on the call, that actually is the whole point of what I'm doing. Okay. So, the overall answer is there is no way to speed it up. But the real answer is it's sped up when you have the right mindset for China business. And let me tell you what I mean by that. You want to speed up this negotiation process and this development of Gwenci and how long it takes to build that necessary trust. Obviously, that trust is an accumulation of goodwill, okay? So you can actually speed that up if you behave more Chinese, right? If you're a foreigner and you're operating in China and you're always not understanding this system of goodwill and reciprocity, then the trust actually never happens, okay? So the way to speed that up is to kind of, first of all, develop a new mindset, okay? Adjust your own attitude towards something that you may or may not agree with, something that you actually don't think is quote unquote right, but you stop being righteous and you stop judging people for their values and their behavior, and you start to exchange goodwill and reciprocity. And this doesn't mean giving money. This just means every time you meet with a potential partner and you're during the negotiation, this is why Chinese people want to meet so much. They want to meet for lunch. They want to meet for dinner. They want to go out drinking. They want to go out karaoke. That's the reason why Chinese people meet so much. This is their opportunity to accelerate the development of Gwenci. It's to accelerate the development of mutual trust. Chinese people don't trust by default. Chinese people mistrust Chinese people more than they mistrust foreigners because they believe foreigners are generally very honest and very kind of gullible and naive. That's how Chinese people think of foreigners. They think foreigners are naive and they're gullible, but they also think they're more trustworthy, okay, by default, okay? To accelerate that is to start behaving more Chinese and developing that real Gwenci relationship, okay? So Henrik, you can actually unmute yourself if you want to kind of jump in and take this discussion a little bit further and tell me whether I've actually answered your question or not. I don't know.
Hey, Gene, can you hear me?
Yep. Hey, Henrik.
Good. Well, you answered the question, but you didn't answer what I wanted to hear, right? So having been here for many years, I know how long time it takes, and I'm still looking for shortcuts.
Well, that might be the answer to your question. Sometimes it's a mindset thing. Sometimes the search for shortcuts actually delays your progress.
Sometimes faster is slower, and sometimes slower is faster.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Just for everybody else in the group, Henrik has got as much or more experience than me. He's in China. He has a consulting company that's called How Consulting, and he also provides a lot of training, coaching, and consulting to help foreigners understand how to do business in China. So we're kind of like colleagues, and I just want to thank Henrik for being on this call, and I look forward to more collaboration with you as we move forward.